Greetings, and welcome back to LA Quill, where we venture into enchanted forests, forgotten kingdoms, and occasionally the terrifying wilderness known as the blank first page. If you've ever sat down to write a novel or stared at a cursor blinking patiently back at you, and then thought, well, this is where greatness begins, only to spend the next 45 minutes debating whether your story should begin with a sunrise, a prophecy, or someone tripping over a chicken, congratulations! You have joined one of the oldest traditions in storytelling. Writers throughout history have wrestled with opening scenes. The opening scene has a rather unfair job. It has to introduce readers to your story, convince them your characters are worth caring about, hint at a world they've never visited before, establish the tone, spark curiosity, and somehow do all of this before the reader decides they'd rather go make tea. No pressure. Yet that's exactly why opening scenes fascinate me. They're tiny promises disguised as paragraphs. Every story begins with an invitation. You're asking someone to leave their own worries for a while and walk in a place that only exists because words arrange themselves in just the right order. Fantasy perhaps makes this challenge even greater, because we're not simply asking readers to meet new people. We're asking them to believe impossible things, often before they've even finished the first page. Readers don't fall in love with fantasy because someone handed them an encyclopedia. They fall in love because they glimpse something wonderful just beyond the next page. They catch sight of a strange creature crossing the road. They hear whispers about forgotten magic. They notice that everyone in the village seems oddly nervous whenever the moon turns green. Curiosity is what carries them forward, not an avalanche of information. One of my favorite ways to think about opening scenes is to imagine them as the first meeting between strangers. You wouldn't walk up to someone at a party and immediately explain your entire family tree and every place you've ever lived and your educational history and your opinions on medieval irrigation techniques. Most conversations begin with something smaller, something intriguing enough that the other person wants to ask questions. Stories work remarkably the same way. Every answer you provide should create two new questions. If your opening tells readers absolutely everything, they've already reached the destination before the journey has begun. On the other hand, if you tell them absolutely nothing, they'll simply wander off looking for another book that remembers to include a map. The very first line deserves special attention because it's the literary equivalent of opening your front door. It doesn't have to explode with fireworks. What it does need is a reason to keep reading. Sometimes that reason is mystery. Sometimes it's beauty, sometimes it's humor. Sometimes it's a single sentence that feels just unusual enough that readers can't help but wonder what on earth is going on. The important thing isn't choosing the correct kind of opening. It's choosing the opening that belongs to your story. Fantasy offers a particularly delightful playground because the ordinary and the extraordinary often stand shoulder to shoulder. A farmer might complain about repairing a fence while absent-mindedly shooing away a griffin. A child might roll their eyes because their grandmother insists on keeping bottled lightning in the pantry. None of these moments need dramatic explanations. In fact, they're often stronger without them because they allow the readers to discover the world naturally. That's one of the greatest temptations facing fantasy writers. We spend weeks and months, sometimes years, building our elaborate worlds. We invent histories and languages, calendars, religions, currencies, trade routes, royal bloodlines, and enough political intrigue to give every kingdom a permanent headache. Then, naturally, we become desperate to tell readers absolutely everything we've created. But resist that temptation. I know it's difficult. The truth is, readers do not fall in love with world building because of how much you've invented. They fall in love because of how naturally that world feels alive. The illusion of depth matters more than immediately revealing the depth itself. Think about visiting a real city for the first time. You don't begin by memorizing every street name or studying 600 years of municipal records. You notice the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery. You watch people going about their daily routines. Little by little, the city reveals itself. Fantasy worlds should do exactly the same thing. This is why action becomes such a powerful vehicle for world building. Instead of explaining that magic exists, let someone casually use it. Instead of describing an elaborate social hierarchy, let two characters interact in a way that quietly reveals it. Readers are remarkably good detectives. They enjoy assembling the puzzle pieces themselves. There's another benefit to this approach. It keeps your opening moving. Movement doesn't necessarily mean sword fights, collapsing castles, or stampeding unicorns. Movement simply means your story is progressing. Something is changing. Someone wants something. Someone fears something. Someone makes a choice. Even the quietest opening scene possesses an undercurrent pulling readers toward whatever comes next. In many ways, stories are like a river. They don't need to rush downhill at impossible speeds, but they should always be flowing somewhere. If readers feel the current carrying them gently forward, they'll happily drift through pages of beautiful description because they trust the journey has a destination. If the water becomes perfectly still, however, they may begin wondering whether they've accidentally wandered into a decorative pond. That sense of forward motion often comes from your protagonist. We don't need to know everything about them immediately. In fact, it's usually better if we don't. Human beings and fictional heroes are remarkably complicated creatures. Trying to explain every aspect of a character in the opening scene is a bit like trying to describe an entire mountain after seeing only one photograph. Instead, show us one meaningful moment, one meaningful choice, one revealing reaction. Readers are astonishingly quick at forming impressions. If we see a character risk their own safety to help someone else, we learn something important. If we see them hesitate before opening a door, we learn something different. If we watch them confidently stride into danger carrying nothing but an umbrella and an unreasonable amount of optimism, well, now we're probably invested enough to keep reading. The beauty of a great opening scene isn't that it answers every question. It's that it convinces readers those answers will be worth waiting for. Somewhere beyond the first page lies adventure, heartbreak, triumph, terrible decisions, unlikely friendships, impossible odds, and perhaps at least one character who absolutely should not be trusted, despite possessing an exceptionally charming smile. The opening doesn't need to deliver all of these things. It simply needs to whisper, "Come a little farther. The story is just beginning." One of the easiest ways to strengthen an opening scene is to remember that conflict doesn't always wear armor. We often hear that stories need conflict immediately, and somewhere along the way, that advice became translated into "someone must be chased by wolves" by paragraph 3. Wolves are certainly effective, they're dramatic, they have excellent teeth, and they rarely improve a person's day. But conflict is much broader than that. It can be uncertainty, it can be longing, it can be the uncomfortable realization that your carefully planned future has just wandered off in an entirely different direction. A young apprentice standing outside a magical academy, wondering if they're truly good enough to enter. Conflict. A queen smiling politely while secretly realizing one member of her council is about to betray her. Conflict. A village baker discovering that someone paid for bread with a coin from an empire that supposedly vanished 500 years ago. Conflict. None of these situations require explosions, yet every one of them quietly asks the reader, well, what happens next? Questions are the real fuel of storytelling. Readers don't keep turning pages because they already know the answers. They turn pages because they want to discover them. Every opening scene should leave a trail of intriguing breadcrumbs. Who is this person and why are they behaving this way? What happens if they fail? What terrible decisions are they almost certainly about to make? Because if we're honest, fantasy protagonists have an extraordinary talent for making decisions that sensible people would politely describe as questionable. Tone deserves just as much attention as plot. Readers form surprisingly strong expectations within the first page or two. If your opening is full of playful banter and amusing observations and the occasional sarcastic raven, readers naturally expect an adventure with room for laughter. If your opening feels solemn and ancient, filled with whispers beneath forgotten ruins and stars that seem to remember older worlds, readers prepare themselves for something grander and more epic. Neither approach is better than the other. The important thing is honesty. An opening should introduce readers to the kind of experience they're actually about to have. Imagine advertising a cozy little village festival only for the second chapter to become an unrelenting horror novel featuring haunted cabbages. Your readers may admire your creativity, but they also might wonder whether someone switched manuscripts halfway through. This is why I often encourage writers to think of their opening scene as setting the rhythm rather than simply delivering information. Rhythm lives in sentence length, dialogue, pacing, imagery, and even silence. Fast scenes feel different from quiet ones. Humorous scenes breathe differently than tragic ones. Long before readers consciously recognize your style, they're already feeling it. Now let's talk about one of the greatest acts of courage a writer can perform, starting later. It's remarkably common for the first draft to begin too early. We become attached to showing every step of our protagonist's ordinary life because naturally we spent weeks imagining it. The trouble is that readers usually arrive hoping to witness the moment life stops being ordinary. If nothing meaningful changes for 10 chapters, chances are your real beginning is hiding somewhere around chapter 11, patiently wondering when you'll finally notice it. That doesn't mean quiet openings are bad. Far from it. Some of the most memorable beginnings in fantasy unfold gently. The difference is that even peaceful scenes contain the faint tremor of change. Something has shifted, or something is about to shift, or someone is standing one conversation away from having their entire life turned upside down. Of course, there are a few opening tricks that deserve a healthy amount of skepticism. The infamous "it was all a dream" opening has earned its reputation for a reason. Readers invest emotionally in those first pages. Discovering that none of it actually happened can feel like spending an afternoon building an elaborate sandcastle, only to discover someone quietly replaced the beach with a parking lot. Likewise, overwhelming readers with 15 named characters, 6 kingdoms, 3 invented languages, and enough family trees to fill a royal archive can leave even enthusiastic fantasy fans reaching for the aspirin. Complexity isn't the enemy, timing is. Every fascinating detail becomes more fascinating when readers already care about the people living inside that world. One exercise I find incredibly useful is asking a deceptively simple question after finishing an opening scene. If I stumbled across this chapter in a bookstore, would I honestly turn the page? It's a surprisingly humbling question because writers know everything that's coming next. Readers know almost nothing. We have to judge the opening from their perspective, rather than our own excitement about Chapter 18, where the dragon finally arrives carrying unexpected emotional baggage. Revision is where many truly great openings are born. Very few writers produce their perfect first chapter on their first attempt, despite what our inner perfectionist insists while dramatically flinging itself across the keyboard. More often, the opening evolves alongside the rest of the novel. As you discover your characters and sharpen your themes and understand your world more deeply, you will also discover where your story truly wants to begin. Sometimes all an opening needs is a stronger first line. Sometimes it needs less explanation and more curiosity. Sometimes an entire chapter quietly waves goodbye because it turns out it was helping the author understand the story rather than helping the reader experience it. That's not wasted work. It's part of the process. Every discarded page taught you something, even if its greatest contribution was bravely sacrificing itself for the greater good of the novel. Perhaps my favorite thing about opening scenes is that they're tiny acts of optimism. Every novel begins with a writer believing someone, somewhere, will care enough to keep reading. That's a hopeful thing. That's an invitation extended across time and distance from one imagination to another. Long after we've forgotten specific plot twists or clever dialogue, we often remember how a story made us feel when we first stepped through the door. So don't chase perfection quite so fiercely that you never begin. Write the opening that excites you. Write the one that makes you curious about what comes next. Then, once you've reached the end of your manuscript, come back with fresh eyes and ask whether your story has found an even stronger place to start. More often than not, it has. Remember, the goal isn't simply to grab your reader by the collar and refuse to let go. It's to earn their trust, to quietly assure them that the road ahead has been carefully chosen, that every strange landmark and mysterious shadow has a purpose, and that however impossible this world may seem, they'll never feel lost for long. That's the real magic of a memorable opening scene. It doesn't merely begin a story, it convinces someone they're about to experience an adventure worth taking. And that's our tale from L.A. Quill today. I'd love to hear about the opening line you're most proud of, or perhaps the one you've rewritten 100 times without quite surrendering to it yet. Until next time, may your stories always be magical.